each city will regulate our product differently. So it's not each country, it's each city. So you could say that we work with at least 300 regulators worldwide.
Before we get started with today's episode, I want to tell you about SpotDraft. If you spend hours every week drafting and reviewing contracts, worrying about being blindsided by renewals, or if you just want to streamline your contracting process, let's talk about an end-to-end AI-powered system that'll save you time. SpotDraft is a contract lifecycle management system that helps in every stage of contracting, from creating and managing templates and workflows to tracking approvals, e-signing, and reporting via an AI-powered repository. SpotDraft does it all. And because it should work where you work, it integrates with all the tools your team already uses. SpotDraft is the key that unlocks the potential of your legal team. Make your contracting easier today at SpotDraft.com. What you need to know if you're considering expanding your business into Europe. How can you effectively scale a global legal team? Where do regulatory obligations fit into all of this? Today, we have Sarah Binder joining us, the General Counsel of Lime, a micromobility scooter company. If you haven't had a chance to ride one, they're pretty fun. Sarah also has global legal experience, including previous stints as GC and Chief Development Officer for Pizza Hut in Europe and the UK, and before that as a privacy, compliance, and legal leader at a number of companies, including in the telecommunications space. Sarah, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Tyler. It's a pleasure to be here.
I'm really excited for this one. We've got a couple of different themes we're going to try to cover off on: international expansion, including expansion that's contingent upon working with regulators. And you're super well positioned to share your stories because you have a very international, global background yourself. You're from the UK. You somewhat recently, maybe a year ago, moved from England to San Francisco. Before we start chatting about business and the law, how was a big move like that for you and your family?
Yeah, it's a good question. It is a big move. I think that you can plan for these things a lot, but ultimately there's a point where you just have to decide that you're going to take the leap or you're not going to take the leap. I have to admit, for us, we as a family, we've really enjoyed the new experiences and opportunities of living on the West Coast in the US, for sure. I think what's great about the global legal role I do now, and obviously many of my roles, is that because they have global reach, I kind of get to spend a reasonable amount of time in lots of different places. But yeah, for sure, it's been really fun. But yeah, there's a point where you're just going to have to sort of jump and see what happens.
I like that. Besides being willing to jump, any advice you'd have for folks who are considering taking a job in a new country or making a big international move, even if it's just, tips and tricks for enrolling your kid in a new school or...
Yeah, again, I think a lot of it was jump. Actually, funnily enough, a colleague of mine was looking for her next role, and she said to me, "I've looked at loads of things, but the only one I'm really excited about is in Thailand. And why is it that?" And so I saw the other day she just moved to Thailand, which is awesome. So I think you have to be really honest with your family and your friends, in terms of like what you are doing. You need to have thought about it. I think as a lawyer, you need to just make sure that your qualifications are transferable. How does that work? And I think probably give yourself more time to transition and kind of pack and unpack than I did. I kind of thought I could do it all in a week. It turned out to be quite full on. But I think, do have a plan and kind of be open to it. I think we kind of came with a pretty open mind about it. And so we've kind of slightly let things kind of dictate where we wanted to go. But certainly for us, things like deciding where we were going to live rather than doing like 3 months in serviced accommodation was something that we felt was important to us. So I think it doesn't really matter what your plan is, but I think sit down and make sure you've had a plan, and do make sure you kind of talk to your team and your
Hmm.
your manager about it, as well, obviously, as your family. And I think you know that you're never going to have planned everything, but yeah,
Sure.
having a plan for sure.
We're going to chat quite a bit about your stories from your time at Pizza Hut and now at Lime. Maybe just to give our listeners context, you could talk a little bit about the scope of your role at both of these companies.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think my roles for both of these roles, and prior roles, have always sort of sat at the kind of nexus of kind of new emerging regulation in the broad kind of tech type industry,
Hmm.
which may not sort of sound immediately apparent. But if I think about what I was doing when I was at British Telecom for a number of years, was I shepherded British Telecom's consumer cell phone division through the implementation of GDPR, and that was very much
Hmm.
the case of, you had some incredible innovations within British Telecom around big data. This is like back in 2015, 2016. There was a lot of
Sure.
innovations about big data, about how you engage with customers, about sort of cohorts, about, sort of that kind of deep analysis, thinking about how you did that with GDPR. Did how did the principles apply to that sort of like innovation in the big data space? So again, that was kind of, I think, a good example of this kind of intersection of tech and sort of new legislation, alongside sort of the rapidly evolving nature of our businesses from a technological perspective. When I was at Yum Brands, that kind of showed up more in terms of, we had a very strong digital agenda, really trying to
Hmm.
transition our business digitally, which turned out to be incredibly important when the pandemic arrived. Sort of being able to continue to operate remotely, and for people to be able to obviously order food online. And so again, there was a big digital transformation piece that sat alongside like the bricks and mortar of a store. How do you do the digital transformation alongside a bricks and mortar type environment?
Yeah.
And then Lime is different in that it's a new industry, but it's a new industry that takes takes two wheels, right? It's bikes and it's scooters. And so it's another form of transport on our roads, but it does require different regulation, different legislation. And so understanding the intersection of that with existing rules around, whether it's traffic, whether it's parking, whether it's how people are able to access our app. Those are all kind of, I think, similar examples of kind of new industries, new legislation, with sort of how you do that alongside the law, is kind of where I've sort of ended up focusing my time on as a general counsel.
And we'll definitely come back to that regulatory piece a little bit later. I want to start with this sort of theme of international expansion. As you're thinking about growing your business internationally, one key piece, of course, is being able to scale out your own team, having the right people in place. You've got a lot of experience in this, with this. How have you done that effectively? I think, especially in this sort of remote environment, without wearing yourself out as the GC in the process.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think I would start by saying it's absolutely an art and not a science. For sure. I think also, just to go back a step, is it's very rarely that it's the general counsel saying we should expand into this market and we should set up an
Mhm.
entity there and we should get people on the ground. It tends to be more that the business is driving that for growth. And I find that in all of the roles I've had, when we're looking at expansion, my first question is always, okay, I understand that X customer, or means that we need to have somebody on the ground in this particular country. Okay, right. What form does that need to take? And so it's always about like trying to understand from the business, what are they trying to achieve by bringing somebody in this particular country that we don't operate? Because I think that
Mhm.
then gives you a bit of a path to what's your recommendation in terms of like the legal framework that should sit around that. Can you actually get a do you need to have, the last resort should be an all singing all dancing local entity, because it comes with a very significant amount of compliance costs. And sometimes it's absolutely the right things to do, but it's definitely worth
Hmm.
pushing the business as to why they want something rather than them just saying, well, this is what I've decided we're doing. So it's worth just pushing and being clear on like, well, what's the best, most cost effective way of achieving that? In
Hmm.
terms of my scaling out of my team at Lime, I scaled out our European legal operation, pretty considerably when I arrived at Lime. And I think, again, it was the sense that some of our most significant markets are in Europe. It's important to have attorneys who can speak the local language. Never underestimate
Sure.
how many documents will arrive in the local language. Um, and also to kind of just understand the cultural sensibilities. I mean, most businesses these days, they're global, but they're incredibly local as well. And so thinking about how
Hmm.
you make that work locally means that often you do need, I think, local local insight. I think one of the things is to be very grounded around what you actually need in that particular region, because sometimes
Hmm.
it might be quite different from what you need in a head office capability. And so, to be practical, like in a head office role, you may need a product counselor who's got deep experience in product counseling with a lot of technical expertise around kind of like privacy or like product development. It may be that if it's more of an operational role in Europe, you need someone with quite different skills. So my team come from a very broad array of kind of past experiences. I have
Hmm.
litigators, I have regulatory lawyers, I have property lawyers, I have a sort of broad range of people who brought different skills that I felt were sometimes needed to that particular region. So maybe one region is very, very advanced in terms of how it engages with cities. Maybe one is sort of quite early in that journey. And so you need to be
Hmm.
really grounded about what you need now. And I think also not always hiring somebody super duper experienced. Sometimes you actually need someone quite junior, and you're going to have to kind of coach them. So I think you have to spend a lot of time about thinking what's actually going to get the job done there and what's realistic. So be realistic of where you actually are rather than where you want to get to, because if you hire the wrong person,
Hmm.
it may take you longer to get to where you want to go. I think using headhunters can be really valuable. They can definitely
Yeah.
bring a perspective that you might not otherwise seen. I think obviously we use a lot of LinkedIn for our recruiting, a lot of building out a network. Sometimes talking to local counsel can be helpful if you've managed to find somebody who can sort of appreciate the sort of different dynamics of where you might be HQ'd and where you're operating. So those are all tips. My most thing is spend time thinking about what you really need, and also make sure you've brought your business along with you in what you're looking for
Hmm.
as well. I certainly had I failed, I think, to fully appreciate that in one country, and I hired a really experienced, very, very good lawyer. And then actually it turned out that a lot of that person's job was going to be handling like genuinely almost administrative matters. And it took a while to like communicate between the business and the lawyer to like work out that their what their role should be. So yeah, bring your business along and be realistic about what you need.
Do you have any, this is just a follow up here. Do you have any sort of like tips or tricks for how, when you're working across that many time zones or that many different markets, you don't get worn out, or you have the right level of sort of information flow between you and folks on your team who you may not have the luxury of being able to hop into a Zoom call with every single day of the year?
Yeah, I mean, like being remote has many advantages, and certainly I think everyone does a much better job of being connected globally than prior to the pandemic because it's become so much more
Hmm.
established. I think it'll depend on like where I'm working with. Sometimes I will often sort of break my day into two chunks. So I'll start really early, but then I'll have a break like halfway through the day for a couple of hours where I won't do
Uh-huh.
anything, or I'll try and chill out or like go for a run or do something. And then I'll pick it up in the evening, late afternoon, evening, to pick up a different time zone as well.
Hmm.
I think that the most important thing that I have felt as a leader that you need to do when you're managing a sort of globally remote team is people need to feel that they can get in touch with you. And so I do feel like having a very flat hierarchy, a low key structure, making it clear on, and whether it's through all hands or any communication you send out, that your Slack is always available. You can always Slack me. You always
Hmm.
have time with me. You just have to ask for time with me, and I will always set up. I think those things have helped to mitigate the fact that you can't be everywhere at the same time. So I think people
Sure.
feeling that they really can come to you and ask you about anything is really important. I have things like drop-in hours, so there's a block of time, each week where people different
Hmm.
time zones where people can just book a slot, and they don't have to like prep in advance and stuff. And I do try to make sure that I talk to a large proportion of my team each quarter as well, so I can sort of check in on, not in a like business update type way, but just check in on how they're doing. We also try and do offsites as well, get groups of people
Yeah.
together, which again, kind of, I really find that those face-to-face interactions, they carry for so long. Like the benefit of doing them carries for so long after the event.
Yes.
Really, really impacting. And so making sure that people make time to build those relationships. So we do a lot of things where we encourage people to engage in lots and lots of different ways online, so that we're all kind of talking to each other. I think it is easier to fall into silos in a remote environment, and so you have
Hmm.
to you have to create frameworks that allows that not to be the case.
Yeah, I think I work remote. I love the remote environment and the flexibility it provides, but I really like the idea of bringing teams together in person on some sort of quarterly or biannual basis. I just noticed that both for myself and others, people treat their work in a much less transactional way once they've been face to face or been talking to people. And they also, I think they're more likely to give other folks on their teams or in other business units the benefit of the doubt when things are going wrong if they have a stronger personal relationship. There's a lot more trust there.
I think it's totally true. I think it's amazing to me how different an in-person experience is. And I think the biggest thing I would say is that you just don't know where a conversation is going to go when it's
Yeah.
in person. There's always, it leads to something that you didn't expect. Whereas to your point, I think when you're talking remotely, they do tend to focus on the issue at hand, and there is less kind of sort
Mhm.
of the medium somehow, I think, allows for slightly less kind of meandering. And I think it's often in the meandering you can find a new solution to a new challenge. I think as lawyers, often you
Mhm.
can find a new challenge that you hadn't really been aware of.
Yeah.
So I think it just gives you more, there's just a greater landscape, I think, when you are in person. And I think making sure that you create the time for that, but then also you make it as productive as possible. For me, when I'm planning an offsite or a team get together, I'm pretty ruthless for every item proposal on the agenda is, could this
Mhm.
be done on Zoom? What are we going to get from this that we wouldn't get on Zoom, to make sure that the quality of conversations and the topics that you're discussing are really things that are going to have lasting impact, but there's something that you just wouldn't get from a Zoom discussion
Mhm.
on
Yeah.
and so that's kind of, I hold quite a high standard. The other thing is we spend a lot of time, you can have fun on Zoom, but it's not super easy to have fun on Zoom. So I also do think that actually it's really important when you spend time with your teams in person that you have fun.
Yeah.
And so we do spend a lot of time building in opportunities for different teams and groups of people to interact with each other. So we'll do a lot of crazy activities. We've done axe throwing. We've done finding this like 4-story kind of like ropes course. That was
Oh yeah.
pretty terrifying. We've done lots of different things like that where people end up in different groups. They spend time with different people that
Mhm.
they don't already know. We do lots of kind of things to build those relationships, because I think team building has always been something that's been important, right? But I think in a remote
Mhm.
context, it's even more important than it was. And actually, that's probably my most primary objective when I bring people together face to face, is for them to deepen and strengthen their personal relationships and knowledge of each other, because that, to your point, is what gets you through the challenges that you may have to deal with, sort of, business challenges day to day.
Quick announcement before I let you get back to the episode. SpotDraft just released our annual compensation report for in-house legal professionals. If you're wondering how your compensation compares to your peers across industries, years of experience, and more, make sure to check it out. Find it at salary-report.spotdraft.com or head to the link in the description. Now, let's get back to the episode. Going back to something that you said earlier, you mentioned that you don't think it's very often that the GC is the one who's saying, hey, we need to expand into this market, this new market, internationally or otherwise. Uh, as you think about sort of global expansion, what do you think the right role of the GC is in that process relative to fellow members of the executive team, right? How should you be working with your fellow executives?
It's a really good question. I mean, I think obviously a GC is a business leader, and obviously they may well have ideas that involve, developing a new market. I think on the whole, though, the general counsel's perspective of developing a new market tends to avoid establishing additional entities, given the additional complexity,
Mm-hmm.
tax requirements, governance that goes with it. I think my role where I've done this, and I've done this in many different companies, is really around efficiency, effectiveness, and kind of how quickly can you get it done? Because obviously everybody always wants it done tomorrow.
Yeah.
Um, so I think a lot of the time it's saying, right, okay, well, what are we trying to do? Okay, I understand that. What's the best way to do it? What are the risks? What are the things we're not thinking about? Could this come back to bite us? Like a lot of the time it's like client, X may have said that we need to have a presence here. Okay, we should do that. That's the right thing to do. Are there things that in a year from now, when I've done this, what are the things I'm going to have wish I'd known and I wish I'd thought about? And so trying to make sure that you are setting up, if you are setting up an entity or you're going to be operating in a different country, is let's think through various scenarios of sort of good, medium to bad of where we are a year from now. So in a year from now, we're
Mhm.
already profitable in this jurisdiction. Okay, that's amazing, fantastic. Hang on, if we thought about tax, what's our tax liability going to be here if we're making a profit? Where are these profits going to be declared? Medium would be we're hitting our business plan. Okay, right. Well, that means we're going to have 25 people here. Are there rules that kick in when you have a certain amount of employees in a certain country? Does that change? Whereas bad is it went really badly and actually we are going to wind up this entity. Okay, right. Did we take out loans? Have we got to pay back loans? Are we in default?
Mhm.
Have we got to wind up the entity? How do we have to go about winding up the entity? If people have never wound up an entity in a foreign jurisdiction, it is a very costly, very expensive process. I have a couple that I think we've been winding up more than 12 months. It can be very costly and expensive. And so what I try to do is be like, a year from now, on those three things, if these things
Mhm.
happened, what would I wish I'd known now to prepare for? So I think, as always, general counsel's jobs is to prepare for the best and plan for the worst. That's your job. So it can look at very many different things. I think if you're growing in multiple different jurisdictions, thinking very hard about your corporate structure, if you're going to have a central European HQ function, thinking about things like data privacy as well, um,
Mhm.
then those things all need to kind of be thought about in advance. That said, I get asked this question a lot by general counsels, I think because I've done it in so many different jobs. It's not very hard. And so I don't think any general counsel or any lawyer should be remotely concerned about we're opening in this market. I've got to set up an entity. I've got to,
Mhm.
make sure that we're registered for tax. I've got to work with accounting. We've got to get employment contracts in place. You tend to be starting small unless you're like going out and you're immediately like hiring 100 employees. I just find that what I do when we're starting small is you just have check-in points where you're like, okay, when we get to 10 employees, we're going to move to doing these types of things. And we're going to perhaps look at our agreement and maybe we're going to now have local council involved because we've got this many people. So I think you just have to keep you have to create your own milestones, which will be different in every single company. Just create your own milestones where you keep kind of checking in. For me, a really important one at Lime was once the entity started being profitable, I knew that I needed
Mhm.
a year before they were profitable to plan for what we would need once they were profitable from sort of a tax structuring perspective. And so knowing that timetable meant I was able to do that. I think one watch out is that also I think what a business often doesn't think about is the costs of operating a foreign entity. It will
Huh.
really depend on your foreign entity, but you should be assuming costs of at least $50,000 a year, if not, and it can definitely go up to sort of more than 200,000. Particularly, you will have to appoint local directors. If you're a new company, particularly if you're in an unproven or unknown sector, the costs of employing an external director may be quite high, really high. And that involves
Interesting.
quite a lot of additional work. You've obviously got to indemnify them. So there's a lot
Hmm.
to think about. And so what we do for every new country that we go into is we will give a breakdown to our operations team that will be like, this is how much we think it will cost to set up this entity and to operate day to day, so that in the business plan you have built in these costs. And a lot of the time you then say, well, does this business plan still make sense if we've got to spend this much
Hmm.
money? And I think that goes back to the challenge of what's the right approach here from a cost benefit perspective. Is it worth doing this? And so often you do, but my focus is always to make sure that the business is going with their eyes wide open on the cost,
Yeah.
the time, and the people resource, because they are quite significant.
You have a lot of experience doing this on both sides of the Atlantic.
Yeah.
I think today, maybe our listeners will become more global after this episode. But I think today a lot of the GCs who might be listening or lawyers who might be listening are based in the States.
Yeah.
What do you think American executives get wrong, or what are common pitfalls that you've seen as they've thought about expanding their businesses into Europe?
I think what I would say is, having worked on both sides of the Atlantic for 6-7 years now, is that I think that the level of understanding that US executives have of operating in different parts of the world, including Europe, continues to grow exponentially, right? Like, I think
Hmm.
the capability and the expectations are much more realistic than they were perhaps when I was first starting doing this work in like 2017, 2018. So I do think it's really changed. And I think things like GDPR have really kind of translated globally. And so people really do think about those types of issues. And I think once you're thinking about one issue, you then think about the others. I
Uh
think
huh.
I think what can get a few kind of minor things that can get confused. I think not everybody's in the EU. Sounds really simple, but
Yeah.
that's actually not straightforward. And there are a number of European countries that are partly member of the EU, but not. So again, that needs thinking through when you're thinking about EU regs. They may not
Yep.
apply in quite the same way. Also, understanding of EU regulations and directives are not the same thing. And it means that often countries will interpret that legislation slightly differently. So for some technical
Hmm.
things, what is applicable in Germany is slightly different in Belgium, for example. So I think really understand what it means to be entering the country that you're going into. Don't just assume that the EU is like one solid block that does everything exactly the same way, because it absolutely doesn't.
Uh huh.
I think that another thing that is not fully understood sometimes is, obviously, I think linked to that is just the huge cultural differences between the countries. The amount of times I've heard people say, "Oh, but it's all EU law," and you're like, "No, it's not." Like, the French had their laws before they became members of the EU. Every country does, and so understanding that each country really is going to be quite different in its approach and its approach to risk. And so, the risk approach is very different in each country, and it's different on depending on what you want to do. And I when I was at Young Brands, I worked across 28 countries. At Lime, I think I work across, I think, sort of somewhere north of 35 countries. Um,
Wow.
there will, and just to be clear, I'm not going to have a huge amount of detailed knowledge of the legislation in every single country, but after
Sure.
a while you do develop like a sort of sense of like, oh, we're doing it in this country, right? Okay, well, I'm going to want to look really carefully at like how these kind of contract provisions work. So I think
Hmm.
really appreciating the cultural sensitivities around different countries. The amount of times I often hear, oh, well, employment in Europe is a nightmare. No, it's not. And actually, quite frankly, or it's really different, or it's really difficult. Well, no, actually, the rule, employment labor legislation between California and Texas is completely different. And so
Yeah.
it's not wildly different to if you're doing a US wide role. It's not wildly different, I think, to that. So I think just being very aware of cultural differences and sensitivities is, I think, really, really important. And actually, it's very similar to the US in a lot of ways, where you just have very different cultural perspectives depending on where you are. But I think taking the time to listen understand that. I also was recommended a brilliant book
Oh.
called the Cultural Map, um, which is really fabulous because it talks about how different cultures communicate, but not just like talking, but how they build relationships, how they take feedback, how they
Sure.
deliver information. And it really does point to some really interesting tendencies. And the reason it's called the map is the idea is that you sort of draw a map of all the different places that you're working and look about how they engage on these different axes of like performance feedback,
Hmm.
building relationships. And it really helps you navigate kind of where you are. So I find that very useful to just sometimes calibrate a bit. Okay, I'm getting on a call with a regulator in this country. I know that these are some of the things I need to focus on. But I think each country is different. I think, and you see that crop up on approaches to litigation, approaches to regulatory disputes. It can be very, very different. Approaches to tax disputes. It can be really different depending on what country you're in. And you just really have to, really listen and understand that your approach that you have used in the US may not be
Hmm.
appropriate in that environment.
We'll find that book for the show notes also, and provide a link in case anyone wants to pick it up. Uh, let's chat a bit more about the role of regulators as you go about expanding internationally. You've got a pretty big team working for you. Working with you? How do you think about your team effectively managing relationships with, I think, such a diverse set of regulatory stakeholders or regulatory bodies?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think there are some businesses that have a huge amount of regulatory breadth. I think just in terms of
Yep.
what we do. The reason that Lime sits in that bucket is that each city will regulate our product differently. So it's not each
Mhm.
country, it's each city. So you could say that we work with at least 300 regulators worldwide. And sometimes even within a city, you may have different parts of the city regulating your product differently.
Mhm.
And so that creates a lot of huge opportunity, but challenge. And so you have to, I think, it's about having clear clear principles and guidance about how you will work with regulators, but making sure that they are locally appropriate and flexible where they need to be. And so
Mhm.
I find that any sort of policy documents, and we spend a lot of time working, obviously, in a big global company on kind of playbooks, on policy documents, you have to make sure that they have the appropriate amount of flexibility in them, because what may make absolute sense to be categoric on a certain point with a regulator in one country won't make sense with the other.
Mhm.
So you have to make sure that they build in that flexibility. Um, when you handle a lot of regulators, you need to really make sure you understand your contractual obligations with them, your verbal commitments with them. You need to make sure you've really got your arms around like how that relationship is being managed and what the issues
Mhm.
are. I certainly expect all of my attorneys who are on the ground in those markets to know who their regulators are,
Sure.
they're up to date on what they're discussing with them, what the challenges are, and there's always some similarity between the issues, but also there's quite a lot of different perspectives as well. I do think, as I say, it's about setting a broad direction on key issues, but making sure that it's flexible where where you need to. We do obviously on top of that, we will have our local regulators, which is our cities. We will then obviously have national regulators or supranational regulators in the case of the EU, whether that's on sort of anything from sort of those types of things would be like whether it's product, whether it's privacy, those types of issues.
As we were preparing for this, one issue area that I think you have pretty extensive experience in is consumer product liability. And I think that's going to be interesting for listeners to hear about, because I don't think that's an area where a lot of GCs maybe have deep sort of roots or experience. Maybe not with Lime, but in a sort of prior life at a different company. Do you have a story that you might be willing to share about what effectively working with a regulator looks like on those types of issues?
Yeah, I mean, I think it sort of goes back to the principle that I said earlier, which is that you need to really understand your regulator and what are the driving motivations for them, so you understand the environment that they're operating in and what are going to be the critical things for them, because it will be different in each country.
Mm-hmm.
um I think one of the things that I have learned, so a long time ago in one role, we had to assess whether we were going to need to do a product recall for a product that was causing quite significant issues in customers' homes. Um,
Uh-huh.
what I have learned, and again, this kind of goes for any kind of crisis that you end up in as a business. The other a very obvious example will be a data breach, is that
Sure.
it's very rare that the information is ever black and white. It never is. And it may be that you have one piece of information that people are like, this is black. And then you'll have another piece of information that's completely white, or you may just have a whole bunch of like gray. And I think what you will discover is that in those situations, and certainly what I discovered when I had to deal with this potential product recall, is you're never going to have a perfect answer. And you will have to work with imperfect information to make the best decisions that you can vis-a-vis communicating with customers, communicating with regulators, communicating with investors and any other stakeholders.
Uh-huh.
A lot of it, and you will often, there will be different perspectives as to the level of engagement that you should be making. But I think my point is, accept it's going to be gray, because certainly the first one that I dealt with, I spent a lot of time trying to make sure that it was clear before I did anything, and I definitely learned that actually you just have to live with the imperfection. um, I do feel that at those times it's really important to think of yourself as a consumer, and I do default to what is the right thing to do. um Definitely make sure that you've got your arms around the information flow, make sure that things are not disappearing outside of the business that you're not aware of. I seem to remember working on another crisis issue where it turned out there were three different teams working on the same issue and they weren't talking to each other. So making sure that you've kind of, I think a general counsel plays a really useful role on any kind of crisis, in terms of just grabbing the
Mm-hmm.
information flow, making sure there is structure and coherence to discussions, to progress, to actions, like really being very, very tight on each action, what's the status of it, and making sure that you continue to progress like through those kind of crisis type issues. So I think those are the things I would suggest. On this particular issue, we were transparent with our regulator. We said, well, we just don't know. This is all the information. This is the information we have. It's not
Mm-hmm.
a clear picture. We are obviously coming to you because we want to work with you on a solution to this. And I think because we were, and it genuinely depends on which country you're dealing with. That's not the approach I would take in all countries for sure.
Mm-hmm.
But in this country, we were transparent, we were open, we were a trusted business. And they said, okay, thank you. Asked a few questions, and we came back and they said, let's talk in 2 weeks. Tell us what you found out, and we'll go from there. And so it was very much kind of like a partner-led approach. And I think in that case, being proactive and transparent um, really did us a lot of I think we ended up in a good position because we took that approach. But
Mm-hmm.
you'll have a lot of things to weigh. I think my overall guidance is there is not a perfect answer, and I don't think anyone has ever run a sort of crisis situation or a product recall situation perfectly. They're hard, they're complex,
Mm-hmm.
they've got a lot of puts and takes. There's a lot of gray information, and you're going to kind of just be okay living in the imperfection of it.
That's great advice around crisis management broadly, uh, and around what the role of the GC should be there. When you think about the role of the GC, maybe in better times, when there isn't a fire, how do you think about setting the right tone around sort of growth and expansion on the one hand, but regulatory compliance and safety maybe on the other?
Yeah, I think, again, often the general counsel's job, I think a lot of the time, is to bring clarity to
Mm-hmm.
potential business situations where you are transparent about whatever the requirements are, the consequences of failing to meet those requirements, and that you're weighing it up against the business need. I mean, one of my favorite coaching things is that a team member will come to you and say, we've got a major issue with this product or in with this market or whatever. And your first question is always like, okay, talk me through what's the revenue? What does it relate to? Like, you've always got to ground in the world of, that's what it's, what we do sits in the world of the business. And so I think grounding it in there is really important. I think a lot of times it's about transparency. It's about quantification of risk. You've got to have a number. You can't show up and you've got to talk the business's language. You have to talk the same language as them. So I think it's about transparency. I think it's about talking the language. It's about meeting the pace and the expectations of the team. You may have some teams that are quite happy for you to take a week considering something carefully, and you have a team that wants an answer, now. So I think thinking about, it's trying to meet them where they are and where they're trying to get to. But I think the most important thing is being clear and on the risks and quantifying them, and knowing when something is a very serious issue as opposed to not doing. The other thing I've also found is that proactive education is really hard because no one has time to do proactive education. And not everybody wants to listen to the lawyers talk about policies and processes all the time. But I find that being proactive about, spending some time when you get into a business and thinking about where are my most material risks, and being proactive about educating your business about risks. Because I actually find that on the whole, businesses, they really want to know where their risks are and their vulnerabilities are, and they want to be able to be educated about them. So I think educating your business teams around those issues as much as you can, and trying to do it before you have an issue, is really, really valuable. And then you can continue to develop the coaching and the level of expertise over time. And so that actually what you really want is that your business is trained well enough that they will be able to spot issues themselves. They may not know what to do with them, but that's fine. But they know when to come to you. And I think if you can land that message with the business. So I think proactive education, and again, I think this comes back to being an accessible person. I think sometimes as lawyers we forget that we feel like we're very accessible, but you fail to appreciate that actually sometimes people are like, oh, but it's going to the lawyer, it's the attorney. And I think being clear that, your job is simply to protect the company, allow the company to achieve its goals, making that point and being accessible, transparent, open, friendly, is really, really important, to kind of actually, and it really helps actually protect, I think, against you not having visibility into what's going on. So I think just continuous education is really important.
That's fantastic advice. I've got just a couple more questions for you as we start to wrap up. You gave us one book in the culture map, so our listeners are going to get a bonus book from you today. I'm a big reader, and I always like to ask guests, or I often like to ask guests something that they've read recently, whether it's a business book or something for fun that they would recommend to others. Do you have a recommendation for us?
I do. It's not new, I'm afraid. It's an oldie but a goodie. But I would say that once a year, at least, I will read Too Big to Fail by Andrew Sorkin, which is about the financial crisis. It doesn't read like a nonfiction. It reads like fiction. It's incredibly pacey. But I think I've always been fascinated by understanding better in the corporate world how decisions are made in crises, what went wrong, what went right. And I think it's such a compelling book of how you navigate a really existential crisis, but also on how important it is to be a human. If in doubt, be a human. But I also think, and how important it is to ask questions, that there is no such thing as a stupid question. And I think when you look at the financial crisis, you look at some of, there was some in the book, it's very clear that just not enough questions were asked a lot of the time. And so I always think that it's a reassuring, I think it's a good sort of way to, it's a good book on sort of how you navigate a crisis. But I always come away with a sort of sense of trying to be human is incredibly important, and also asking questions, and there is no such thing as a stupid question, is helpful. And it's a really good It's a really good book. So yeah, I read that. I read that one a lot. So if you haven't read it, it's amazing. It's very,
I have not.
but it's really, you'll read it quite quickly. You'll be surprised.
I think there's an HBO show maybe that was based on it that I've seen.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm fascinated by the Great Recession and read like Tim Geithner's memoir and a few other books, but I have not read that one. And so you picked something right up my alley, Sarah.
Oh, well, that's a relief.
One last question for you before we let you go.
Yeah.
That I like to ask of almost all of our guests. You know, if you could look back on your days when you were just getting started as a lawyer, what's something that you wish you'd known then that you know now?
There are many things, but I think I would probably say worry less about titles and worry less about career progression. Worry more about the type of work you are doing, the type of people you are working with, and what you are learning. I think when I was more junior, it was more important of like, meet the next career rung, what's next. And I think also just the sort of hierarchical structure of a lot of business, but particularly law firms, kind of drives you towards that. And I think what I've learned over time is that actually it's the quality of the experience that you are getting that matters way more than, the salary or the title or whatever. And so, I think it never fails me of how never surprises me more of sort of how many people you meet who, everyone's career path looks pretty different, and there is actually no linear career path. And if there is, then there really isn't one. And so I think just trying to be cognizant of what you're learning and the experiences that you're getting is more important than the title or the next rung on the ladder.
That is really meant to be the idea of there not being one linear path. I think one of the big messages of a lot of these interviews and of the podcast series. So thank you so much for joining us today and for such a dynamic interview. And really, really appreciate your time.
Oh, Tyler, it was an absolute pleasure. It's been so fun to connect. So thank you so much. I really, really enjoyed it.
Thanks for tuning in today. If you enjoyed this episode, I'd recommend that you give my interview in Season 1 with David Lancelot, Chief Legal Officer of LawView, a listen. We talk about practicing abroad and how to effectively scale your legal team. You can also subscribe so you can get notified as soon as we post a new episode. And if you like this one, I'd really love to hear your thoughts. So leave a rating or a comment. If you'd like to reach out to me or Sarah, our LinkedIn profiles are in the description. See you next week.